we need to address climate change. But when you're doing those kinds of things and buying a leaky old pipeline for $4.5 billion from a company that realized that there's no future in it, pawning it off on taxpayers, and then reapproving it the day after you tell us that there is a climate emergency, and then reapproving it, and the cost of that is going to be an additional $12 billion.
The Conservatives have come out, and Peter has said it tonight, that they're going to get rid of the carbon tax, which is a carbon copy of what the PPC platform has already been months and months ahead of time. But yet, you're still going to reach the Paris Accord targets that Andrew Scheer has said that he is going to stay with. So how do you expect to cut the carbon tax, but still make the targets? And you've also said that you want to build the pipelines. How are you doing all this? Is this magic?
Mr. Lee is entirely correct in that. We will meet our Paris Accord targets, and these are conservative targets. We believe in having an effective climate plan that actually works. Canada is uniquely positioned to deliver to the world innovative solutions that will help solve a global problem. If the solution to climate change and carbon emissions is a voluntary tax, country by country, which is a reduction in the quality of life, we will never see the developing nations in Africa and Asia who seek a better life forego the improvements that they need in order to meet our targets.
And the climate action plan that the Conservatives, you say, have is non-existent. There is no climate action plan. In fact, Professor Jacquard of the Simon Fraser University was quoted as saying in The Spectator that the Conservative plan is vague and non-existent or non-detailed. That's an expert on climate matters. Whereas the same professor said in the same article in The Spectator that the Liberal plan for the climate action plan is fair and reasonable and makes sense. In fact, most economists, if not all economists, and most experts in the field believe that the Liberal plan for the climate action makes sense. In fact, over 50 measures to fight climate change have been introduced by the Liberal government over the past 4 years. They've also invested in better public transit in communities. They've invested $2 billion in the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and they've made the largest investment in nature conservation in Canadian history. These are all things that the Liberal government has already done. They also plan to do more. I've mentioned some of the things earlier.
They do plan to do more. Raise the carbon tax to 100 per ton.
As far as the Conservative climate plan goes, it's pretty clear what will happen. First of all, you set the lowest targets in the industrialized world. And while Harper was there, he did nothing. He did nothing to achieve those targets. And I must admit that the Liberals haven't done much more. The Green Party is the only party that will actually meet the targets that are required by science for us to avoid runaway global warming. And this election is a climate referendum. The next election will be too late. Unless we do something about global warming, the runaway global warming, we are not going to have another election where we have an opportunity to elect a government that can do something about it. As far as the Conservatives go, and the Liberals, I want to see action. We hear words. So far, the Conservatives, what they have done, and I'm talking about your provincial counterpart, Mr. Ford, is done everything that he can to dismantle any progress that we've made. So to say that the Conservatives have a fine climate plan with the weakest targets in the industrialized world and no desire at all to meet them is absurd.
And you're right, David, because the Conservatives
20 seconds.
have the Conservatives under Mr. Harper, and Mr. Scheer is just a ditto of Mr. Harper, they abandoned the Kyoto Protocol and they're climate action obstructionists. And I have to tell you that the Liberal actions have been fair and reasonable, and they are good plans. In fact, with the oil pipeline, David, as you mentioned, Canadian society is complex. We cannot just destroy a whole industry all at once. We have to transition into
I'm gonna
climate
jump in.
action.
The Liberal carbon tax is going to crush Canadian businesses and industries, even with trade-exposed exemptions. How do you say what's trade-exposed in 2019? We're going to export our remaining manufacturing overseas to some of the dirtiest jurisdictions on earth. Under Trudeau's carbon tax plan, we are going to see global emissions rise. We are going to see more environmental disasters in more countries. We should be making things in Canada, the cleanest place in the world to make things, and we should be using Canadian energy to do it. We should have pipelines bringing clean, ethically sourced Alberta petroleum, the most ethically sourced, safest produced oil in the world, to our East Coast refineries
Need a
instead
question.
of buying them from Saudi Arabia.
Need a question.